Following the conclusion of the Third Servile War, Pompeius Magnus, whose arrival had precipitated the decisive battle, immediately wrote to the Senate. He claimed that indeed, Crassus had defeated the slaves, but that he, himself, had extirpated the war. This infuriated Crassus. He had done all the work, had trained his legions, and had covered the cost from his own personal resources. Most importantly, he had fought the final, decisive battle which saw the annihilation of Spartacus's army. Now Pompeius Magnus, for doing nothing more than marching onto the scene at the very last moment, claimed the victory as his own. It must have seemed to Crassus like these military men were all the same. Gaius Marius had claimed the victory at Numidia, though it had been Metellus Numidicus who had spent 2 years laying the groundwork, and Sulla who had actually captured King Jugurtha. Servilius the Augur had thought to walk into Sicily's Second Servile War, and claim the laurels of victory off the shoulders of the Lucullus who had actually turned the war in Rome's favor. And hadn't Pompeius Magnus chomped at the bit to rush into Spain to capitalize on the groundwork laid down by Metellus Pius? Now, since Spain didn't work out as Pompeius had planned, he would simply claim the victory over Spartacus as a consolation prize. So, following the close of the Third Servile War, Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus continued to disagree over which one of them the Senate should honor. Though it is impossible to say for certain, it appears that during this time, a private deal was struck which involved Pompeius, Crassus, and even Julius Caesar. Although it is not certain in what capacity Julius Caesar served, it seems likely that he would have been assigned as a military tribune in the army of Crassus. Since it was probably Crassus from whom Caesar's family borrowed the exorbitant amount of money with which to ransom him from his pirate captors, Caesar would have been in a position to be of some service to his financial benefactor. Still ranked a military tribune from his posting in the east, under Lucullus, Caesar probably volunteered for service in Crassus's army to increase his total number of campaigns against his first step on the cursus honorum. But something happened between these three men. 70 BC was a year during which, on the surface, little appeared to get accomplished. Yet, by 69 BC, Roman government would completely change. Despite Sulla's constitutional reforms, which legally required consuls to first hold the office of praetor, and to be no less than age 42, the Senate either asked Pompeius Magnus to stand for the consulship, or Pompeius demanded the right to run for the office under the thinly veiled threat of legions camped outside the city. Even though the 35-year-old general had been granted propraetorial powers by Catulus Capitolinus, Pompeius had otherwise held no public office whatsoever. He was still not even a senator, as were both Crassus and Caesar. Pompeius was simply a wealthy man, who had inherited an army from his father, and knew how to use it. In addition to a run for the consulship for the 70 BC year, a second triumph of an extra-legal nature was hastily pushed through the Senate in order to celebrate Pompeius Magnus's victory over Sertorius and Spartacus. Because Sulla had allowed Pompeius his first triumph, without the necessity of being praetor or consul, the Senate could find no precedent with which to deny him. Additionally, the Senate was anxious to reward Metellus Pius for his role in bringing down Sertorius as well. Crassus, knowing that to do so now would only look like he was grasping at straws, did not petition the Senate for a triumph, or even for the lesser ovation. But he continued to fight Pompeius's claims to have won the Third Servile War. This disagreement, along with the fact that Pompeius had his army threateningly close to Rome, led Crassus to set his army down right outside the city as well. With two armies camped outside the city, both generals squabbled with each other, and with the Senate, over who should be granted the honors of defeating Spartacus. As Pompeius Magnus made plans to become the first consul who had never even been a senator, Crassus played a completely different game. He maintained his army outside Rome while styling himself the city's protector against the threat of Pompeius's legions. He promised the Senate, and Roman people, that the moment Pompeius disbanded his legions, Crassus would discharge his own soldiers. But Pompeius claimed he, and his men, were only awaiting the arrival of Metellus Pius, and that after the triumph, in which his soldiers had a right to march, his legions would be disbanded. Although both generals, with armies camped around Rome, had the upper hand, they were also both equally guilty of treason. Except where a triumph was requested by a general, and approved by the Senate, generals were legally required to disband their armies before returning to Rome. But Pompeius Magnus marched his army to Rome first, then, with legions at his back, asked the Senate for his triumph. And Crassus marched his army to Rome in response to Pompeius, though the Senate had not requested any military aid from him. Whether it was by a grateful Senate, or as the result of his encamped legions, Pompeius Magnus was granted the right to run for election as consul. Despite how the Senate truly felt about awarding such a man the highest position of government, the Senate was not without its recourse. A consul was immune to any form of legal prosecution during his term of office. That prosecutorial immunity extended to his proconsulship in whichever province he drew to govern following his term. However, after his provincial duties concluded, a proconsul became, once again, a private citizen. The Senate might have to wait 3 or 4 years, but someone was certain to prosecute Pompeius Magnus for failing to disband his army. Crassus was a different story. The only thing that kept him, thus far, from being prosecuted, was his standing army. The moment he disbanded his legions, he would be open to immediate prosecution. In order to prosecute Marcus Licinius Crassus, the Senate would not have to wait several years. Then, all of a sudden, these two opposing generals, who had threatened one another for months with a show of arms, announced they would run for the 70 BC consulship on a joint ticket. Though even the ancient sources speculate as to what brought these two opposing forces together, it was clearly the result of some arrangement to which the public, and the historians, were not privy. Although it cannot be stated with absolute certainty that this sudden friendship was the result of a secret pact Caesar made with both Crassus and Pompeius, it seems likely given the nature of the legislation which immediately followed. By both Pompeius and Crassus becoming consuls, each general pushed back, by at least 3 or 4 years, the time frame in which they could be prosecuted for treason. Within that time frame, many things could change. Pompeius Magnus, who always worked to maintain his immensely popular public image, deflected the public's outcry for the charismatic general to disband his army. Pompeius knew there was one thing the Roman people wanted even more: they wanted the office of tribune of the plebs restored to the rank it held prior to the office's dismantling by Sulla. The ancient sources tell us that, because Pompeius and Crassus's pretense of friendship lasted only long enough for them to get elected, their consular terms were otherwise impotent. Whatever one consul legislated for, while holding the fasces, the other vetoed. By this consular gridlock, we are led to believe that Pompeius and Crassus cancelled one another out on all important legislation. Yet, by the time they stepped down as consuls in December of 70 BC, the office of tribune of the plebs was restored. This would have been no easy legislation to pass, considering the Senate was still primarily conservative. It would have taken massive amounts of bribes in order to sway the Senate into supporting such a bill. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. Pompeius, the inheritance from his father notwithstanding, had amassed his own private fortune from campaigns in Sicily, Africa, and Spain. These two men, who were likely in league with Caesar, could easily afford the necessary bribes. Another office that was restored under the consulships of Pompeius and Crassus was also probably used to this effect. The censorship, an office left defunct by Sulla, was an even more prestigious office than the consulship. Only ex-consuls who had shared the same consular term were permitted to run for the censorship. In 109 BC, when House Speaker Marcus Aemilius Scaurus was elected to the censorship with the father of tribune of the plebs, Marcus Livius Drusus, it was because both had been elected consuls in 112 BC. This unique rule for candidates meant that families who boasted a censor held far more political clout than mere consular families. Unlike the consulship, censors were elected for a period of time known as a lustrum, or 5 years. The office could only be maintained as long as both censors remained alive. Thus, the death of Marcus Livius Drusus the Elder in 108 BC negated the office of Marcus Aemilius Scaurus. Until the end of the lustrum, and the election of 2 new candidates, Rome simply did without the office of censor. Censors were responsible for maintaining the census. They oversaw the financial status of Roman citizens, and made certain they were placed within the appropriate classes, based on their financial holdings. A censor could eject any member of the Senate who, because of bad debt, or even loss due to natural phenomenon, no longer met the necessary financial requirements for senatorial admission. They moved people up and down within the classes according to their rising and falling fortunes. Additionally, censes, much like the Pontifex Maximus, governed Rome's public morality. Any senator found to have disregarded the moral expectations of his status could be ejected from the Senate by the censors, even if he still maintained the necessary financial requirements. A censor's word was final, and could not be overruled by any other magistrate below dictator. The two men elected to this restored office were the same two consuls who had been stripped of their commands as punishment for their humiliating defeat by Spartacus, Publicola and Clodianus. Both of these men were in the pay of Pompeius Magnus and, with Pompeius's massive support and ability to bribe, easily won the censorship despite their tainted reputations. Publicola and Clodianus, upon assuming office, began a purge of the Senate. During their term, some 87 senators were removed from the Senate, which could be directly related to the legislative success behind the restoration of the office of tribune of the plebs. By restoring the tribunate to its former legislative function, Pompeius and Crassus could, as had been done in the past, purchase tribunes of the plebs to legislate legal changes which would completely remove them from future prosecution. Caesar, who by this time was running for election as quaestor for the upcoming 69 BC year, would also have been planning his own long-term future, a future for which he likely foresaw the need of a restored plebeian tribunate.